Hi, gender and politics people. I have missed you guys so much, and I hope that you're all healthy and well. I'd love to hear from you, even if it's just checking in or putting something on the course questions. Email is a great way to get in touch with me, but of course, if you want some face-to-face time with me, I have office hours on Mondays and Wednesdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Even if you're just tired of being stuck inside with your parents and your brothers and sisters, that's a great way to get in touch with me, get back into sort of a university vibe. We could chat, we could talk about whatever. So utilize those. Moving forward, let me know if you have any challenges, even if you feel like they're your fault. Let me know. I'm making my goal to be, of course, fair to the whole class, but accommodating to individual students when they need it. Everyone is going to have different challenges. For example, as much as I have taught online, I have never had such a huge push from the university as we go online to be on Zoom. And I get why, because you guys signed up for individual classes. So you should get that individual feeling, that individual touch of a professor. And so I get why we're doing Zoom, but I have struggled. I've had 3 lectures so far not work. And one for you, I just recorded it and the whole thing was on mute the whole time. And it was so depressing. And there was no way to video edit my way out of it because literally my computer's microphone was just turned off. So I'm going to do it again. And hopefully this time it'll be more succinct and polished just for you. So first, I just want to make sure that everybody has seen the revised syllabus. It is on our main Blackboard page. Changes are highlighted in yellow. Gray, shut the door. Those are my kids. Changes are highlighted in yellow. Things that are no longer relevant are struck out. So attendance, struck out. I'm not counting attendance anymore. It's meaningless. I am counting participation on the discussion forums, but even that is going to be probably a lighter standard than normal. But as far as changes that are really important, the final project is totally different. It's going completely individual, and it's taking a way different turn for some of you, if you choose it, than I would normally do in a politics class. And so one is kind of basically what you would have done as a group. You're just going to do it on an individual level, write a policy memo about a problem with women's rights or a gendered problem in the United States. So what you'll do is you'll say what the problem is and the extent, give a bunch of evidence, give your policy solution, maybe talk about where it's worked in other countries or why you think it will work here, counter arguments, who would say no, they don't like it, and then a rebuttal. Classic policy memo. I'll post some more guidelines on that if you've never done one, but they're very straightforward and they have a really particular succinct structure. And so that'll be the 5 pages. Then if that seems outside of your realm of capability right now because you were planning on doing something similar with a whole group, that's fine. And what I've decided to do is allow you to read a piece of feminist fiction and talk about how it affected a women's movement, what place it has in women's movements, and what feminist concepts that it presents, and how it maybe even challenged society at the time. At first, I thought it really should be a book, but upon further reflection, considering that the libraries are all down, I didn't want somebody to have to spend money if they didn't feel like they were in a position to be able to spend money. So short stories are also okay, and those are really widely available on the internet. However, of course, you're still going to have to do an analysis of a much shorter story that's just as long as the others, and you won't have quite as much to work with. So it will probably require a similar amount of legwork on your part. Moving on from that, I do believe those are the main questions that I've had so far. Discussion leaders, the only other thing was discussion leaders just post a discussion by Friday and everyone will respond by the following Friday. So we're always going to be on a 1-week lag. It's not ideal, but because the whole thing just changed on us, that's the only way I think of doing it. So that's the administrative stuff, I think, out of the way. We're going to get to just a little short lecture, the only one for the whole week. Right now, basically kind of just paging through your chapter and then talking briefly about Roe and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. So chapter 9, And one good thing about having abortion be the first week we move online is that most of us are probably pretty familiar, at least more familiar than our other concepts in the course, pretty familiar with abortion politics. I mean, the United States is so highly polarized. Everyone has their own opinion. Everyone, is very staunchly invested in their own opinion for the most part. And at least if not, what those two different or what the spectrum of opinions is. And so an example of that is this this chart on page 139 that shows that people have been similarly polarized on this issue since 1976 as compared to 2016. There's no other issue in American politics that is that stable. None. Where about 25% of people think it should be legal in no circumstances. That one's gone down a little bit. And about 25% of people think that it should be legal in all circumstances. And then 50% of people say it should be legal in some circumstances. And this is totally flat all the way through. And so that's really particular to abortion. It's particular to abortion in the United States that it's that polarized. But of course, this is a terrible survey. What does that mean, legal in some cases? That is where the real contentiousness lies, where people are very, very, very strongly, have a lot of strong feelings of what should and should not be allowed. And that's where we come to this bar chart on page 140 that goes from, 9% of only 9% of people think abortion should be illegal if the woman's life is in danger. And only 36% of people think abortion should be legal simply because the family cannot afford the child. And so we have a broad range of things that people think abortion should be illegal and abortion should be legal. And the way I read this and the way I interpret the different spectrum is a lot of the time the line for people is, well, could the mother have been in control of those circumstances or not? And so for the woman's life to be in danger, those are those very sad stories where women who desperately want a child can't have a child because they're going to die or they're going to get very injured. And so those we have the most sympathy for. These are totally out of control of the parent. Pregnancy caused by rape and incest is another one that has broad support, even in the more conservative wings of American politics. However, when we get to things like whether that the mental health is endangered, whether the baby is going to have some kind of impairment, or whether the woman simply doesn't want a child or feels like they can't afford a child, those kinds of things are like, well, that's your fault. Like, you should be able to raise a disabled baby. You should, get your mental health in order. Why don't you make more money? Too bad you don't want a child. Every woman wants a child. You'll see, right? So those kinds of reasons are becoming, or people have less and less sympathy for because they feel like they're more in control of either the outlook or the circumstances they fell into. And so those are that is the gamut of that spectrum. So as the next thing I kind of want to talk about after public opinion is the differences by state in the United States. And these differences are outrageous. It's one of the most confusing things that's so important to people that each state could vary so much. So for example, 45 states in the United States agree and have passed legislation that healthcare providers can refuse to participate in an abortion. And you can imagine why. If the healthcare provider believes it's murder and they've taken an oath to do no harm and they believe it's murder, then they should not have to perform an abortion. So you can see that's 50% or 45 states. Whereas some of them, there's only a handful of states that make certain laws. So for example, the woman must be told of the purported link between breast cancer and abortion, or they must be informed of the consequences for their mental health of being of having an abortion. So those things are the more kind of innovative stretches. And you can really see from this chart on 146 that states really vary in their restrictiveness. And the most restrictive states are going to be these darker ones, and the least restrictive are going to be these much lighter ones. In fact, these two have none of the restrictions listed. So here are the restrictions that they're talking about: a 24-hour waiting period, mandatory counseling, mandatory ultrasound, a ban on all abortions after 24 weeks of pregnancy unless the woman's life is at risk, parental consent, the clinic must meet the conditions of a surgical center, and that the provider must have hospital access. So those two things are talking about the level of the abortion being conducted in a place where they can have surgery and that it's conducted by a doctor. Whereas there's a lot of states where abortions can be completed by some kind of other healthcare worker, like a registered nurse or a nurse practitioner, because they don't actually involve surgery. They're more medicinal and then just aftercare, right? So as you can see, these really range from like 24-hour waiting period, which is much less restrictive, to the hospital privileges one, which is more restrictive. And even though all these states are colored the same, these just mean they have the same number of restrictions in place. They might be different restrictions. And so from state to state, we don't really have a regular citizen, even a really politically interested person, isn't going to have the knowledge of what neighboring states' laws are. And so that's really confusing. But it does allow for state shopping, policy shopping, which means that some women are going to be able to go to a different state and obtain an abortion because they've done their research and they can get there. And their state, a different state has less restrictive rules. You can guess who those people are, right? They're going to be the wealthy citizens. So just as we learned in the feminist video, and we learned later in the abortion debates, wealthy women are very much less prohibited from getting an abortion in most circumstances because they have the time and the resources to go state shopping or policy shopping, as we would say it in political science. Okay, at this point, I have this like indescribable urge to ask you, what questions do you have? Who's concerned about this? Da, da, da. But that's not the world we live in right now. At least that's not the world I'm creating right now. So take a minute, pause, go to the course questions forum. If that becomes a real hot place for discussion and debate, I'll even open up something else like class time questions or something like that. They can be procedural. That's really where most of my course questions have come from in the past. But if you want to talk about content, let's talk about it. This is going to be up to you how much you want to participate, and I'm going to be there every step of the way. So pause me. Go ask your questions. Okay, I'm assuming you paused me and came back. Okay, so real quick, let's just kind of go through Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey and their influence on American politics. So Roe versus Wade was the first major Supreme Court abortion case, and it essentially invented the idea of trimesters. I mean, it had existed before, but it's really not very scientific, and the Supreme Court really made it the way that we talk about it now. So Roe versus Wade basically said you can't ban abortions before 24 weeks, which is, or not before 24 weeks, in the first trimester. And so that was like the landmark decision. And then after that, it was all a balancing act. So as usual with Supreme Court cases, they're always balancing interests. And in this case, it's the interests of the mother in both privacy and health, and the interests of the potential human life. And so what they decided was that over time, the rights of the potential human life become more and more and more real because the human life becomes more and more and more viable, meaning can live outside the womb of the mother. So in the first trimester, no go. You can't ban abortions. In the second one, you really start balancing. What's the reason? Certainly it can be to protect the health and the life of the mother, as it can in the third trimester as well. But what's the reasoning behind that? And then after what we call viability, the ability of the fetus to live outside the womb, then the restrictions are like, okay, the restrictions that are allowable are like, okay, is the mom going to die if this baby stays in her? Is the mom going to die if we take the baby out? Is the mom going to be really physically injured? Those kinds of considerations. So after the baby can live outside the mom, the restrictions are really like life versus life. And before that, in the middle, it's kind of muddy. And then in the beginning, it's not as muddy. But as you can see, well, I'll get to that once again. And so Roe versus Wade was this really landmark decision occurring in the early 70s, right as women were really having a strong second wave feminist movement, talking about the ERA, really getting rights out there. And so it was a landmark decision. It also partly was the reason for the death knell of the equal rights movement and the ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment, because it became so associated, abortion became so associated with feminism, and the country was too divided on that. Unlike equality, they were not on board with that. And so bear in mind that the right to abortion in Roe versus Wade is derived from the notion of a right to privacy in the Constitution. So from the First, Fourth, Fifth, 14th Amendments, all your due process language, all of your protection of privacy from like illegal search and seizure, those kinds of things. That's where it comes from, the right to, and primarily the privacy of the historical privacy didn't exist for women to have these rights to these decisions. Instead, it was really the right for a family to have these decisions. And so it really kind of derived out of that. I'm going to circle back to that in a second. So then we have Planned Parenthood versus Casey. It comes out, many years later. And Planned Parenthood versus Casey was like in response to all of these like little laws that were putting more and more and more restrictions on when women could have an abortion and when they couldn't, and what they had to do beforehand. And so you can imagine all these different kinds of things that we're talking about. They were saying, well, this isn't fair. And they put a pretty high standard. They said the only restrictions you cannot place are restrictions that place an undue burden on the mother. So things like that would be so burdensome that it would either prevent the person from being physically able or mentally able to do it, or even just chronologically able to do it, like waiting periods that were much too long. So in this case, they upheld things like parental consent and waiting periods. And the only thing that they struck down as an undue burden was the requirement of a woman to get the consent of her husband. And you can think of all kinds of reasons why women don't need consent of their husbands to do anything, and particularly in healthcare. It's very protected. We don't do that anymore. I mean, that was like language that sounds like, pre-suffrage. So you don't need consent. Not pre-suffrage, pre-second wave feminism, right? Back, that sounded like 70s language when women had to get consent to get a credit card or whatever, and housing and stuff like that. So it was just, much too outdated. And so that was an undue burden. You can also imagine they had some witnesses saying, what if the woman is in an abusive relationship? This could get her killed, things like that. So those are the kinds of things that are placing an undue burden. The last thing that I want to talk about is just because abortion is such a contentious issue in the United States, and because the two parties don't agree very well at all, it does make the right to abortion, or the lack of a right to abortion, very uncertain in any given time, because different people can be elected to the legislature and change the laws. They can change the Violence Against Women Act to change the laws. They can change all kinds of health protection acts to change the laws. So, for example, Democrats are moving to negate the Hyde Amendment kind of regularly now, which says that federal money can't go towards abortion. So that's not really very secure. That's probably going to change if Democrats take both houses of Congress. Well, certainly they'll need the presidency, a Republican presidency can sign off on that. So they're going to maybe try to get rid of the Hyde Amendment. But on the other hand, abortion restrictions could become much, much more restrictive because of the changing tenor of the Supreme Court due to some recent conservative appointments. And so as Brennan noted, sort of slyly but truly, Supreme Court Justice Brennan said, if you have 5 people, if you have 5 votes in this house, and, you know, in the Supreme Court, if you have 5 people, you can do anything you want, which is a little scary, and I think it surprises students, but it's absolutely true. They get to say what the Constitution says. They do it well, and they make really good flowery words with it, but they can really say whatever they want, right? And so overturning Roe versus Wade is not outside of the power of the Supreme Court, even if it doesn't make a lot of jurisprudential sense in terms of following jurisprudence from the past. So just be aware of that it is, despite public opinion being pretty steady on it, because it's 50-50-ish, it's always changing. So that's democracy in action. That is all I have for today. I hope this one worked and I don't turn it off and see that it was muted the whole time. But I miss you guys. Quiz on Friday, pretty easy, just stuff I've highlighted today and stuff from the videos. It'll be open from Friday to Sunday night. And I'll have another video for you guys after the weekend. Bye.